So hello everyone. For this session, we will talk about existential therapy, its key concept and the dynamic of the therapeutic process from the book of Gerald Carey, Theory and Practice of Counseling and Psychotherapy. So before we start, let us first know our learning objectives for this session. So first, be familiarized with the main proponents of the existential therapy, be able to understand its key concept and therapeutic goals, and lastly, be able to understand the therapeutic process and its application, therapeutic techniques, and procedures. Okay, so to begin with, first let us define what is existential therapy. So, existential therapy is more of a way of thinking or an attitude about psychotherapy than a particular style of practicing psychotherapy. It is neither an independent nor separate school of therapy, nor is it a clearly defined model with specific techniques. Existential therapy can be best described as a philosophical approach that influences a counselor's therapeutic practice that focuses on exploring themes such as mortality, meaning, freedom, responsibility, anxiety, and aloneness as this relates to a person's current struggle. So the essence of this approach, according to Yalom and Joselson, is an attitude toward human suffering that has no manual. It asks deep questions about the nature of the human being and the nature of anxiety, despair, grief, loneliness, isolation, and anomie. It also deals centrally with the question of meaning, creativity, and love. So, the goal of existential therapy is to assist clients in their explorations of the existential givens of life, how these are sometimes ignored or denied, and how addressing them can ultimately lead to a deeper, more reflective, and meaningful existence. Clients are invited to reflect on life, to recognize the range of alternatives, and to decide among them. Did you know that existential approach rejects the deterministic view of human nature espoused by traditional psychoanalysis and radical behaviorism? Although deterministic forces affects us and we sometimes cannot control external events thrust upon us, existential therapists believe we retain the freedom to choose how we respond to such events. And that is because existential therapy is grounded on the assumptions that we are free and therefore we are responsible for our choices and actions. We are the authors of our lives and we design the pathways we follow. A basic existential premise is that we are not victims of circumstance because to a large extent we are what we chose to be. So now we move on to the historical background in philosophy and existentialism. The thinking of existential psychologists and psychiatrists was influenced by a number of philosophers and writers during the 19th century. These major figures of existentialism and existential phenomenology and their cultural, philosophical, and religious writings provided the basis for the formation of existential therapy. So we have here Soren Kierkegaard. He is a Danish philosopher and a Christian theologian. Kierkegaard was particularly concerned with angst. It is a Danish and German word whose meaning lies between the English words dread and anxiety, and he addressed the role of anxiety and uncertainty in life. Existential anxiety is associated with making basic decisions about how we want to live, and it is not pathological. Without the experience of angst, we may go through life as sleepwalkers. But many of us, especially in adolescence, are awakened into real life by a terrible uneasiness. Life is one contingency after another, with no guarantees beyond the certainty of death. This is by no means a comfortable state, but is necessary to our becoming human. According to Kierkegaard, he believes that the sickness unto death arises when we are not true to ourselves. So what is needed is the willingness to risk a leap of faith in making choices. Becoming human is a project, and our task is not so much to discover who we are as to create ourselves. Next, we have here Friedrich Nietzsche. He emphasized the importance of subjectivity. Nietzsche set out to prove that the ancient definition of humans as rational was entirely misleading. We are far more creatures of will than we are impersonal intellects. But where Kierkegaard emphasized the subjective truths of an intense concern with God, Nietzsche located values within the individual's will to power. We give up an honest acknowledgement of this source of value when society invites us to rationalize powerlessness by advocating otherworldly concerns. So we also have here Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's phenomenological existentialism reminds us that we exist in the world and should not try to think of ourselves as beings apart from the world into which we are thrown. The way we fill our everyday life with superficial conversation and routines shows that we often assume we are going to live forever and can afford to waste day after day. Our moods and feelings, including anxiety about death, are a way of understanding whether we are living authentically or whether we are inauthentically constructing our lives around the expectation of others. So when we translate this wisdom from vague feelings to explicit awareness, we may develop a more positive resolves about how we want to be. Phenomenological existentialism, as presented by Heidegger, provides a view of human history that does not focus on past events but motivates individuals to look forward to authentic experiences that are yet to come. So here we have Martin Buber. He said that we humans live in a kind of betweenness. That is, there is never just an I, but always an other. The I, or the person who is the agent, changes depending on whether the other is an it or a thou. But sometimes we make the serious mistake of reducing another person to the status of a mere object, in which case the relationship becomes I or it. Buber stresses the importance of presence, which has three functions. First, it enables true I or thou relationships. Second, it allows for meaning to exist in a situation. And lastly, it enables an individual to be responsible in the here and now. However, Buber argued that the therapist and client could never be on the same footing because the latter comes to the former for help. When the relationship is fully mutual, we have become dialogic, a fully human condition. So as you can see, we have here Ludwig Binswanger. He is an existential analyst and he proposed a holistic model of self that addresses the relationship between the person and his or her environment. He used a phenomenological approach to explore significant features of the self, including choice, freedom, and caring. He based his existential approach largely on the ideas of Heidegger and accepted his notion that we are thrown into the world. However, this thrownness does not release us from the responsibility of our choices and for planning for the future. Binswanger contended that crises in therapy were typically major choice points for the clients. Although he originally looked into psychoanalytic theory to shed light on psychosis, he moved towards an existential view of his patients, and this perspective enabled him to understand the worldview and immediate experience of his patients as well as the meaning of their behavior, as opposed to superimposing his view as a therapist on their experience and behavior. Existential analysis, according to him, emphasizes the subjective and spiritual dimensions of human existence. So this is Menard Boss. Both Binswanger and Boss were early existential psychoanalysts and significant figures in the development of existential psychotherapy. They made reference to Dasein, or being in the world, which pertains to our ability to reflect on life events and attribute meanings to those events. They believe that the therapist must enter the client's subjective world without presuppositions that would get in the way of this experiential understanding. Boss Major's professional interest was applying Heidegger's philosophical notions to therapeutic practice, and he was especially concerned with integrating Freud's method with Heidegger's concepts as described in his book Daseinalysis and Psychoanalysis. And lastly, we have here Jean-Paul Sartre. He is a philosopher and a novelist. The existence, according to him, of space or nothingness between the whole of our past and the now frees us to choose what we will, and our values are what we choose. And the failure to acknowledge our freedom in choices results in emotional problems. This freedom is hard to face, so we tend to invent an excuse by saying, I can't change now because of my past conditioning. So Sartre called excuses bad faith, that no matter what we have been, we can make choices now and become something quite different. We are condemned to be free, and to choose is to become committed. This is the responsibility that is the other side of freedom. And Sartre's view was that at every moment, by our actions, we are choosing who we are being. And our existence is never fixed or finished. And now we move on to the key figures in contemporary existential psychotherapy. So as you can see, we have here Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, Erwin Yalom, and James Bugental that all developed their existential approaches to psychotherapy from strong backgrounds in both existential and humanistic psychology. So some of their contributions to psychotherapy are illustrated in the brief sketches that follows. So here is the famous Viktor Frankl. He was a central figure in developing existential therapy in Europe and also in bringing it to the United States. As a youth, Frank was deeply influenced by Freud, but he became a student of Adler. Later, he was influenced by the writings of existential philosophers, and he began developing his own existential philosophy and psychotherapy. Frank was fond of quoting Nietzsche, that he who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow. Frank contended that those words could be the motto for all psychotherapeutic practice. Another quotation from Nietzsche seems to capture the essence of his own experience in his writings: that which does not kill me makes me stronger. Frank developed logotherapy, which means therapy through meaning. Frank's philosophical model shed light on what it means to be fully alive. The central themes running through his works are life has meanings. Under all circumstances, the central motivation for living is the will to meaning. We have the freedom to find meaning in all that we think, and we must integrate body, mind, and spirit to be fully alive. Frank said that Freud viewed humans as motivated by the will to pleasure, and that Adler focused on the will to power. For Frank, the most powerful motivations for humans is the will to meaning. Frank's writings reflect the theme that the modern person has the means to live but often has no meaning to live for. The therapeutic process is aimed at challenging individuals to find meaning and purpose through, among other things, suffering, work, and love. So next is Rollo. Along with Frank, psychologist Rollo was deeply influenced by the existential philosophers, by the concept of Freudian psychology, and by many aspects of Alfred Adler's individual psychology. May was one of the key figures responsible for bringing existentialism from Europe to the United States and for translating key concepts into psychotherapeutic practice. His writings have had a significant impact on existentially oriented practitioners. Of primary importance in introducing existential therapy to the United States was the book Existence, A New Dimension in Psychiatry and Psychology. According to May, it takes courage to be, and our choices determine the kind of person we become. There is a constant struggle within us. Although we want to grow toward maturity and independence, we realize that expansion is often a painful process. Hence, the struggle is between the security of dependence and the joys and pains of growth. So this is Irvin Yalom. Irvin Yalom is a significant contemporary existential therapist in the United States, and he acknowledges the contributions of both European and American psychologists and psychiatrists who have influenced the development of existential thinking and practice. Yalom has developed his approach to individual and group psychotherapy based on the notion that existentialism deals with basic givens of existence, which includes isolation and relationship with others, death and living fully, and meaninglessness and meaning. Yalom believes the vast majority of experienced therapists, regardless of their theoretical orientation, employ many of the core existential themes. He also contends that how we address these existential themes has a good deal to do with the design and quality of our lives. Yalom recognizes Frank as an eminently pragmatic thinker who has a quality or impact on his writing and practice. He also acknowledges the influence on his writings of several novelists and philosophers. More specifically, he draws on the following themes from this philosopher discussed earlier: from, from Kierkegaard, creative anxiety, despair, fear and dread, guilt and nothingness; from Nietzsche, death, suicide and will; from Heidegger, authentic being, caring, death and guilt, individual responsibility and isolation; and from Sartre, meaninglessness, responsibility and choice; and lastly from Buber, interpersonal relationships, the I or thou, perspective and therapy, and self-transcendence. So at this juncture, we will move on to the key concept of the existential therapy, its view of human nature, and the propositions. So, view of human nature. The crucial significance of the existential movement is that it reacts against the tendency to identify therapy with a set of techniques. Instead, it bases therapeutic practice on an understanding of what it means to be human. The existential movement stands for respect for the person, for exploring new aspects of human behavior, and for divergent methods of understanding people. It uses numerous approaches to therapy based on its assumptions about human nature. The existential tradition seeks a balance between recognizing the limits and tragic dimensions of human existence on one hand and the possibilities and opportunities of human life on the other hand. It grew out of a desire to help people engage the dilemma of contemporary life, such as isolation, alienation, and meaninglessness. The current focus on the existential approach is on the individual's experience of being in the world alone and facing the anxiety of this isolation. Also, no relationship can eliminate existential isolation, but aloneness can be shared in such a way that love compensates for its pain. The existential view of human nature is captured in part by the notion that the significance of our existence is never fixed once and for all. Rather, we continually recreate ourselves through our projects. Humans are in a constant state of transition, emerging, evolving, and becoming in a response to the tension, contradictions, and conflict in our lives. Being a person implies that we are discovering and making sense of our existence. We continually question ourselves, others, and the world. Although the specific questions we raise vary in accordance with our developmental stage in life, the fundamental themes, however, do not vary. We pose the same question. Philosophers have pondered throughout Western history. The questions that include who am I, what can I know, what I ought to do, and what can I hope for, and where am I going. So here are the basic dimensions of human conditions according to the existential approach. So we have the capacity for self-awareness, freedom and responsibility, creating one's identity and establishing meaningful relationship with others, the search for meaning, purpose, values and goals, anxiety as a condition of living and awareness of death and non-being. The development of this proposition is in the following sections by summarizing themes that emerge in the writings of existential philosophers and psychotherapists. And I also discuss the implication for counseling practice of each of these propositions. So, um, let's elaborate more on these propositions. So, in the proposition 1, or the capacity for self-awareness, freedom, choice, and responsibility constitutes the foundation of self-awareness. The greater our awareness, the greater our responsibilities for freedom. So Snager explains that the core existential position is that we are both free, willful, creative, and expressive, and limited by environmental and social constraints. We increase our capacity to live fully as we expand our awareness in the following areas. We are finite and do not have unlimited time to do what we want in life. We have the potential to take action or not to act, and action is a decision. And we choose our actions, and therefore we can partially create our own destiny. And also, meaning is the product of discovering how we are thrown or situated in the world, and then through commitment, living creatively. As we increase our awareness of the choices available to us, we also increase our sense of responsibility for the consequences of these choices. We are subject to loneliness, meaninglessness, emptiness, guilt, and isolation. We are basically alone, yet we have an opportunity to relate to other beings. We can choose either to expand or to restrict our consciousness because self-awareness is at the root of most other human capacities. The decision to expand it is fundamental to human growth. So here are some areas of emerging awareness that individuals may experience in the counseling process. They see how they are trading the security of dependence for the anxieties that accompany choosing for themselves. They begin to see that their identity is anchored in someone else's definition of them. That is, they are seeking approval and confirmation of their being in others instead of looking to themselves for affirmation. They learn that in many ways, they are keeping themselves prisoner by some of their past decisions, and they realize that they can make new decisions. They learn that although they cannot change certain events in their lives, they can change the way they view and react to these events. They learn that they are not condemned to a future similar to the past, for they can learn from their past and thereby reshape their futures. They realize that they are so preoccupied with suffering, death, and dying that they are not appreciating living. They are able to accept their limitations yet still feel worthwhile, for they understand that they do not need to be perfect to feel worthy. And lastly, they come to realize that they are failing to live in the present moment because of preoccupation with the past, planning for the future, or trying to do too many things at once. Increasing self awareness, which includes awareness of alternatives, motivations, factors influencing the person, and personal goals, is an aim of all counseling. Clients need to learn that a price must be paid for increased awareness. And as we become more aware, it is more difficult to go home again. Ignorance of our conditions may have brought contentment along with the feeling of partial deadness, but as we open the doors in our world, we can expect more turmoil as well as the potential for more fulfillment. So for the proposition number 2, freedom and responsibility, a characteristics existential theme is that people are free to choose among alternatives and therefore play a large role in shaping their own destiny. It embraces three values. First, the freedom to become within the context of natural and self-imposed limitations, the capacity to reflect on the meaning of our choices, and the capacity to act on the choices we make. A central existential concept is that although we long for freedom, we often try to escape from our freedom by defining ourselves as a fixed or static entity. We have no choice about being thrust into the world, yet the manner in which we live and what we become are the result of our choices. Because the reality of this freedom, our task is to accept responsibility for directing our lives. However, it is possible to avoid this reality by making excuses. In speaking about bad faith, the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre refers to the inauthenticity of not accepting personal responsibility. Freedom implies that we are responsible of our lives, of our actions, and of our failures to take actions. From Sartre's perspective, people are condemned to freedom. He calls for commitment to choosing for ourselves. Existential guilt is being aware of having evaded a commitment or having chosen not to choose. And this guilt is a condition that grows out of a sense of incompleteness or a realization that we are not what we think we might have become. Guilt may be a sign that we have failed to rise to the challenge of our anxiety and that we have tried to evade in by not doing what we know is possible for us to do. And lastly, authenticity implies that we are living by being true to our own evaluation of what is a valuable existence of ourselves. It is the courage to be who we are. So for existentialists, then, being free and being human are identical. Freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. We are the authors of our lives in the sense that we create our destiny, our life situations, and our problems. Assuming responsibility is a basic condition for change, and clients who refuse to accept responsibility by persistently blaming others for their problems are not likely to profit from therapy. So the third proposition, striving for identity and relationship to others. People are concerned about preserving their uniqueness and centeredness, yet at the same time, they have an interest in going outside of themselves to relate to other beings and to nature. Each of us would like to discover a self, or to put it more authentically, to create our personal identity. This is not an automatic process, and creating an identity takes courage. As relational beings, we also strive for connectedness with others. The trouble with so many of us is that we have sought directions, answers, values, and beliefs from the important people in our world, rather than trusting ourselves to search within and find our own answers to the conflicts in our lives. We sell out by becoming what others expect of us, and our being becomes rooted in their expectations, and we become strangers to ourselves. That is why we must have these values. First values is the courage to be. Beliefs awareness of our finite natures give us an appreciation of ultimate concerns. It takes courage to discover the true ground of our being and to use it power to transcend those aspects of non-being that would destroy us. Courage entails the will to move forward in spite of anxiety-producing situations such as facing our death, that we struggle to discover, to create, and to maintain the core deep within our being. One of the greatest fears of clients is that they will discover that there is no core, no self, no substance, and that they are merely reflections of everyone's expectations of them. Next is the experience of aloneness. The sense of isolation comes when we recognize that we cannot depend on anyone else for our own confirmation. That is, we alone must give a sense of meaning to life, and we alone must decide how we will live. Before we can have any solid relationship with others, we must have a relationship within ourselves. We are challenged to learn to listen to ourselves, and we have to be able to stand alone before we can truly stand beside another. Next is the experience of relatedness. Here, we humans depend on relationship with others, and we want to be significant in another's world, and we want to feel that another's presence is important in our world. When we are able to stand alone and tap into our strength, our relationship with others are based on our fulfillment, not our deprivation. If we feel personally deprived, however, we can expect little but a clinging and symbiotic relationship with someone else. Perhaps, one of the functions of therapy is to help clients distinguish between a neurotically dependent attachment to another and a life-affirming relationship in which both persons are enhanced. Lastly, struggling with our identity. Part of the therapeutic journey consists of the therapist challenging clients to begin to examine the ways in which they have lost touch with their identity, especially by letting others design their life for them. The therapy process itself is often frightening for clients when they realize that they have surrendered their freedom to others and that in the therapy relationship, they will have to assume their freedom again. By refusing to give easy solutions or answers, existential therapists confront clients with the reality that they alone must find their own answers. A distinctly human characteristic is the struggle for a sense of significance and purpose in life. Existential therapy can provide a conceptual framework for helping clients challenge the meaning in their lives. The problem of discarding old values. One of the tasks of the therapeutic process is to help clients create a value system based on a way of living that is consistent with their way of being. The therapist's job is to trust in the capacity of the client to eventually create an internally derived value system that provides the foundation for a meaningful life. They will no doubt flounder for a time and experience anxiety as a result of the absence of clear-cut values. The therapist's trust is important in helping clients trust their own capacity to create a new source of values. Here, in the meaninglessness, it is the major existential neurosis of modern life. Meaninglessness in life can lead to emptiness and hollowness, or a condition that Frank calls the existential vacuum. This condition is often experienced when people do not busy themselves with routine or with work. Because there is no preordained design for living, people are faced with the task of creating their own meaning. At times, people who feel trapped by the emptiness of life withdraw from the struggle of creating a life with purpose. Experiencing meaninglessness and establishing values that are a part of a meaningful life are issues that become the heart of counseling. And lastly, creating new meaning. Logotherapy is designed to help clients find meaning in life. Yet meaning is not something that we can directly search for and obtain. Finding satisfaction and meaning in life is a byproduct of engagement, which is a commitment to creating, loving, working, and building. Meaning is created out of an individual's engagement with what is valued, and that is commitment provides the purpose what makes life worthwhile. I like the way Bontress captures the idea that meaning in life is an ongoing process that we struggle with throughout our lives. What provides meaning one day may not provide meaning the next, and what has been meaningful to a person throughout life may be meaningless when a person is on his or her deathbed. So the fifth proposition, anxiety as a condition of living. Anxiety arises from one's personal strivings to survive and to maintain and asserts one's being. And the feelings anxiety generates are an inevitable aspect of the human condition. Existential anxiety is the unavoidable result of being confronted with the givens of existence: death, freedom, choice, isolation, and meaninglessness. Existential anxiety arises as we recognize the realities of our mortality, our confrontation with pain and suffering, our need to struggle for survival, and our basic fallibility. We experience this anxiety as we become increasingly aware of our freedom and consequences of accepting or rejecting that freedom. Existential therapists differentiate between normal and neurotic anxiety, and they see anxiety as a potential source of growth. Normal anxiety is an appropriate response to an event being faced, while neurotic anxiety, in contrast, is anxiety that concrete things that is out of proportion to the situation. Neurotic anxiety is typically out of awareness and it tends to immobilize the person. And lastly, we have the proposition 6, the awareness of death and non-being. So the existentialist does not view death negatively, but holds that awareness of death as a basic human condition gives significance to living. A distinguishing human characteristic is the ability to grasp the reality of the future in the inevitably of death. It is necessary to think about death if we are to think significantly about life. Death should not be considered at rest. That provides the motivation for us to take advantage of appreciating the present moment. Instead of being frozen by the fear of death, it is force that enables us to live as fully as possible. So now we move on to the therapeutic goals. An aim of a therapy is to assist clients in moving toward authenticity and learning to recognize when they are deceiving themselves. Existential therapy aims at helping clients face anxiety and engage in actions that is based on the authentic purpose of creating a worthy existence. Existential therapists are mainly concerned about helping people to reclaim and reown their lives. The task of existential therapy is to teach clients to listen to what they already know about themselves, even though they may not be attending to what they know. Snyder and Krug identify four essential aims of existential humanistic therapy. First, to help clients become more present to both themselves and others, to assist clients in identifying ways they block themselves from fuller presence, to challenge clients to assume responsibility for designing their present lives, and lastly, to encourage clients to choose more expanded ways of being in their daily lives. While increased awareness is the central goal of existential therapy, which allows clients to discover that alternative possibilities exist where none were recognized before, clients come to realize that they are able to make changes in their way of being in the world. Existential therapy places central prominence on the person-to-person relationship. It assumes that client growth occur through this genuine encounter. It is not the techniques a therapist uses that makes a therapeutic difference. Rather, it is the quality of the client-therapist relationship that heals. It is essential that therapists reach sufficient depth, openness in their own lives to allow them to venture into the client's subjective world without losing their own sense of identity. So the contribution of the existential approach is that it helps bring the person back into central focus. It concentrates on the central facts of human existence, the self-consciousness and our consequent freedom, and to the existentialist goes the credit for providing a new view of death as a positive force, not a morbid prospect to fear, for death gives life meaning. Existentialists have contributed a new dimension to the understanding of anxiety, guilt, frustration, loneliness, and alienation. I particularly appreciate the way Van Dursen views the existential practitioner as a mentor and fellow traveler who encourages people to reflect upon the problems they encounter in living. What clients need is some assistance in surveying the terrain and in deciding on the right route so that they can again find their way. Like any other approach, existential therapy has its own limitations and criticism. A major criticism, often aimed at this approach, is that it lacks a systematic statement of the principles and practices of psychotherapy. Some practitioners have trouble with what they perceive as its mystical language and concept. Some therapists who claim adherence to an existential orientation describe their therapeutic style in vague and global terms such as self-actualization, dialogic encounter, authenticity, and being in the world. This particular use of language causes confusion at times and makes it difficult to conduct research on the process or outcomes of existential therapy. However, according to Van der Sen, the main limitation of this approach is that of the level of maturity, life experience, and intensive training required of practitioners. Existential therapists need to be wise and capable of profound and wide-ranging understanding of what it means to be human. Authenticity is a cardinal characteristic of a competent existential practitioner, which is certainly more involved than mastering a body of knowledge and acquiring technical skills. Russell puts this notion nicely. Authenticity means being able to sign your own name on your own work in your life. It means you will want to take responsibility for creating your own way of being a therapist. So to summarize, as humans, according to the existentialist view, we are capable of self-awareness, which is the distinctive capacity that allows us to reflect and to decide. With this awareness, we become free beings who are responsible for choosing the way we live and we influence our own destiny. This awareness of freedom and responsibility gives us rise to existential anxiety, which is another basic human characteristic. Whether we like it or not, we are free, even though we may seek to avoid reflecting on this freedom. The knowledge that we must choose, even though the outcome is not certain, leads to anxiety. This anxiety is heightened when we reflect on the reality that we are mortal. Facing the inevitable prospect of eventual death gives the present moment significance, for we become aware that we do not have forever to accomplish our projects. Our task is to create a life that has meaning and purpose. As humans, we are unique in that we strive toward fashioning purposes and values that gives meaning to living. Whatever meaning our life has is developed through freedom and commitment to make choices in the face of uncertainty. So that would be all. Thank you for listening.